Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are in the world, and welcome to this panel on post-launch life. My name is Deanna Stanley, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel today. I'm coming at you from Montreal, where I work at Ubisoft as an associate producer on Rainbow Six Siege, and right now my team's wrapping up our 6th year post-launch. If you're not familiar with supporting live games after launch, don't worry. We're lucky to have these 3 amazing humans with us to share their diverse experience in the video game industry and beyond. We're going to discuss a variety of topics today that'll probably touch on more than just supporting games post-launch. Our panelists are going to share some stories with you, probably drop a cat pun or two, and hopefully provide you with some insights into the challenges, best practices, and do's and don'ts of post-launch life. So for the audience, we can't see you, but we really encourage you to interact in the chat, ask your questions throughout, share your own insights and stories, and we're going to use that to steer the conversation as well. Our panelists want to talk about what you want to hear, so we're not going to wait until the end to look at your questions. So without further ado, we have with us today Michael Silverwood from Pixel Studios, Cardell Kerr from Proletariat, and Hans Reifenrath from Phoenix Labs. I'm going to pass them the mic to speak a bit about themselves, and we'll start with Cardell.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cardell Kerr. I am an executive producer at Proletariat. I've been in the games for over 20 years now, and I've never worked on a non-live product. I've only ever worked on multiplayer games. When I started, it was in massively multiplayer games, a company called Turbine, which eventually became Warner Brothers. And then from there, working at Proletariat, we've only ever made multiplayer games, which means that this topic was very, very dear to me because I don't even know what life would be like in a world where you weren't constantly pushing more updates live on a monthly, if not weekly basis.
Thanks, Cardell. I'm going to pass it to Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael, founder of Pixile, and similarly, I've only ever made live service games. Also, only made indie games, so never worked for a bigger studio. But we've done a lot of this live service. We've been building a game called Super Animal Royale for the last 4 years. The last 3 years, it's been in early access, and we just launched version 1. So we've had the whole live service all the way through early access, starting with weekly updates. Then we realized that was a little bit too crazy, switched to 2 weeks, then to 3 weeks. And now we have a pretty nice regular cadence now that we've come out in version 1. And then also had the interesting experience for the first time of when we launched in version 1 of going from just being on Steam on PC and Mac to adding in all the other consoles and how that changes the live service support game when we're now on Switch and Xbox and PlayStation as well.
Always fun adding new platforms.
Yeah.
So Hans, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Hans Reifenrath, and I am a product manager over at Phoenix Labs. I've been in the games industry since the 90s, started in paper games at Wizards of the Coast and Games Workshop, and worked up into video games, working at PopCap Games, so kind of at the birth of sort of shareware, like the shareware games, into then Facebook games and mobile games. That slowly has evolved into other sort of large service stuff at LinkedIn, and then moved into some more multiplayer games at a startup, Ghostly Bear Games. And now at Phoenix Labs, we've been working on Dauntless, and Dauntless has been post-launch for about 4 years. I've been here for about 2 of those and really focused on shipping every 2 weeks on 4 platforms in a cross-play environment. So that's been quite an active last couple of years. So.
I can imagine and have lived a similar experience. Cool. So thanks, you guys, for those introductions. So for everyone listening, even if you've never worked on a post-launch production, everyone's probably pretty familiar with some of the things it entails, like we've already discussed here today. It can be bringing new content. It can be expanding on different platforms, but the list is pretty endless. So if you think back on your favorite games in recent years, some of them might have shipped with buggy servers, missing content, or just really basic systems. And after time, obviously, the initial issues are going to be addressed pretty quickly, but after time, the game can evolve into something completely different than when it shipped. So for our panelists, since people in the audience might not be familiar, and because everyone has a different definition, how would you define post-launch? What are the biggest factors for you? Michael, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, it's a hard question because I don't think there's necessarily even one point, which is kind of what defines a live service game. I mean, your first launch would maybe be if you're doing something like early access. Definitely treat that as a launch. The second it's out, now you're doing live service. So I would say that's basically already post-launch. And then whatever it means to hit a version 1 and actually release, I guess that would be a second version, a second post-launch. And for us, that did look a little bit different than the first sort of post-launch being available because of, adding new platforms. You're working towards a big, like, this is feature complete. We're not just building the core foundation of the game anymore. You're shifting into then like constant content. So not just building the core features of the game, you just keep having to add more and more content for players to play as you go.
For sure. Cardell, what about you? Any thoughts on your official definition of post-launch?
Oh dear. I'm going to walk you through chronology, and you can bear with me. So starting off, like back when I was working in just worked in games, was just working on my very first massive multiplayer game, there really was no concept of the early access. You had alphas, very limited alpha, and then you had maybe a beta, and then you had an open beta, which is mostly for stress testing and marketing purposes, and then there was full launch. And normally, at that time, free-to-play was not really big in, obviously, in West, and it was mostly just a clear delineation of you've launched at this stage, and now you can begin your ongoing updates, which are still relatively new to the industry, but there was definitely at least a blueprint for. I actually think that my definition has shifted a lot more, and I think I'm going to riff a little bit on the early access portion. It's like I try to look at launch now is just your different gradations of a controlled fall. Because what's actually happening is you start with your early access, and your game is not done, and everyone in the development team knows your game is not done, and really all of your audience knows is not done too. Like, this is the whole purpose of them paying for an early access. But the number of people that you're going to have in early access versus where you're trying to get to is probably an order of magnitude, if not multiple orders of magnitude off of what you're trying to do, and even what you've actually built to maintain. So like, I think that for the purposes of actually criticizing your product, launch actually starts at early access the instant you have strangers whom are unafraid to tell you that they aren't impressed by your work. Like, that's actually when you launched. And we've all been there, and it's sometimes uncomfortable, but it's very important. And then from there, the rest is mostly layering additional features on, some of which you knew you needed but didn't have time to build, some of which are actually informed by the feedback you're getting. And that's kind of a dry run for the ongoing update process as it stands. So maybe in some ways, it's actually safer to say that launch has effectively gone away in favor of staged access. And really, it's like games that never hit a critical mass beyond a certain point in stage access never get launched because there's no reason to launch them, because you're fully aware that there aren't enough people to play it. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Probably, especially to people who have experienced it. So, yeah, sorry. So, sorry, my thing is freezing for a second here. Hans, do you have any thoughts on that too before we move on?
I would definitely just have to concur. Like, for me, it's the as soon as you're engaged with the public in any way, and particularly in a way where people are opting in to support you in some way, you're really building that foundational cycle of how you build that relationship with the community, and those relationships that you build, even in those very early days, like the founders alpha back in August of 2017 for Dauntless, we still have people who are coming back that are either champions or critics of the new things or major changes. And how you establish that relationship early, and you establish that cycle with the team of going from inception all the way through community input, that creates that relationship, that creates that cycle, and it also builds the confidence of the team. So I kind of feel like as soon as you get out the gate and you start building those cycles, you're on the rails at that point. You've got to keep going, and getting people like engaged in that kind of introspection as the community is giving you feedback is what makes those ongoing releases like more and more successful. So.
And do you guys think with the launch itself that there's a bit of a safety blanket to launching like that, like knowing that it's expected that everything won't be finished, that you have room to get everyone's feedback and implement those things? Or do you think it's more difficult than a traditional, everything is done and this is what you have?
I personally think it's just you've made an exchange is the best way of putting it. So like, instead of having a full launch where, you it's like the full rehearsal, you've got all your stuff there, everything's ready. And if they don't like it, that's on you. And if they do like it, that's on you. Like, that's what a full launch was versus like the stage launch. It gives you a lot more freedom to make mistakes on stage because everyone expects that. But it also makes it much harder to know whether or not there's something intrinsically wrong with what you've done, because it could just be missing things or it could be bad. And inevitably that's where I think a lot of the tension comes from. It's because like it's trying to forecast that.
Yeah, and I think the iterative nature that comes into that, if you're not paying really close attention to not just the qualitative, but the quantitative, it becomes really hard in that early access phase to understand where you should focus. If you're only focusing on qualitative or only focusing on quantitative, it's really easy to kind of fool yourself, justify like, oh, well, no, it's just this Fatui issue. See, we have a drop off in retention right here. Like, it's really easy to fall into those traps. But if you are actively engaged with the community, so you can really make that comparison, I think it is a stronger stance. If you don't have the capability to do that, I think having the additional polish time and getting something more substantial out, I think for me feels more successful. But getting that balance between the two and having that iteration, I think gets the community building, and it gets the right kind of balance for like, actually, we're trying to improve the game. So.
For sure. You guys mentioned the community factor a lot. Obviously, it's a really important factor. Everyone has some war stories with the community, I'm sure. But in these cases where we're leading up to launch, how early is it important to get the community involved?
Well, for us, yeah, I can't speak to every game, but we basically just tried to do it as early as possible. And part of that had to do with an unknown indie when we started making Super Animal Royale. So we had no players at all. So it was a combination of getting feedback on the game as we were building it as early as possible, and also building an audience. And we knew that, like, as a battle royale, you have 64 players playing simultaneously, split between regions, split between multiple modes. So it's like exponential how many players you need. So we started, I think it was about 5 months into development, and we launched into early access within a year. So we were doing testing with community weekly all the way leading up to that launch. And I don't think that we could have successfully launched without doing that, because it both provided all of that feedback for polishing the game, making sure it was actually ready for the launch, and just like growing the player base early, since when you have a live service game and you're doing all this post-launch content, you're also simultaneously building a community at the same time. So you're kind of building two things at once. And yeah, so as early as possible on that one, because community building, it takes a lot of time, especially if you're building it from scratch. But it does kind of like snowball and accumulate over time the longer you're doing it.
I would definitely agree. I think the opportunity to get particularly those sort of, alpha champions that can help you also somewhat, tier out the championing of your game from your community, like getting those relationships built early, so that they can be a positive voice for you as well, I think is a really great way to get started. So
I want to take a slight step back in the sense of, I want to distinguish between community versus audience, because I do think they sometimes are conflated. So when I consider what an audience for a game is, often it is all of the people that are currently involved or engaged in your game. Your community is often the people who are speaking about your game and interacting with other people that are within, or perhaps interacting in your Discord server or in other form of sanctioned forums that you have that allow people to actually communicate with each other. Now, your audience, your community, you can make the argument community exists within your audience. I don't even know if that's necessarily true for games that have been out for a very long period of time, but like, I don't want to get down that rabbit hole yet. But once you separated that in your head and understand that this audience is effectively the silent engagers and the community are the actual vocal ones, it becomes a little bit easier to know when you need to engage your community. And my general rule of thumb is you should engage your community when you're ready to listen to them. If you are not ready to listen to them, you should not engage your community. And there are lots of reasons why that'd be the case, right? Like there's cases where you're just not ready. This game isn't quite done. You don't know what to say or what to show or even how to position it. Like probably don't need to engage your community then. You can mine your audience. You can send out a bunch of questionnaires, surveys, and a bunch of other things to just get an understanding of who is even reading your updates. But you're not really working with your community until you're ready to actually start engaging in a relationship with them. And it's, there is definitely some level of support you have to give them and some level of support they demand from you. And that's okay, because that's healthy. Like that is all relationships in your life should be defined by that. And if they are not, then there are probably greater problems. In terms of actual methods of involvement, I think that there are lots of different ways to involve your community. I know that for us, for Spellbreak specifically, we did a lot of very specific like guided tours of the game when we were in early access. Like there were times where either Seth, our CEO, or me, or in some cases our community manager would just run an orientation for anyone who just gained access to the game. We just popped in the Discord channel, walked them through it, showed them the screen, kind of like it was that level of kind of, you could argue a white glove experience, but it was what we wanted to do at that stage to be able to kind of polish off the corners and try to figure out how do we improve the quality of the communication, both from us to our community and from our community to us, because based off of those interactions, lots of people were completely willing to give suggestions, on the fly, which is super helpful to us and really helped us iterate in the game very early. But I mean, I do think it's important to remember when you get into the point where you're going to engage your community and you're going to listen to them, you need to have a very, very concrete understanding of the objective, what you see as objective facts or truths about your game. Because if you don't have a good understanding of what that is, you can rapidly start to iterate towards a very outspoken community in a manner that doesn't necessarily loop in the audience that I was talking about before. Because there is a point where your community can get to the point where they are so specialized that the things they're asking for are not things the audience is asking for, and not even things the audience can appreciate. And sometimes that's good, but sometimes it's not. And as a developer, you have to own the responsibility for that.
Yeah, and I think that goes into the balance between sort of that qualitative and quantitative again. Like the audience for your game, the quantitative is where you're going to really get the vast majority of the information about how they're engaging, how they're actually working their way through the game, and that qualitative that's coming in through those community channels is something that making the comparison between those two to understand how these fit together and where the right places to respond are is a big piece of that. That's a great point.
Yeah, I just can't. I guess this has happened to me enough in my career, and I'm hopeful that people who are listening can learn from my horrible mistakes, which is to say that you have to really find a method to get information about the people who are not talking all the time. Because in all fairness, the majority of your audience are people that are not talking to you all the time. So the sooner you can find a good proxy for them or a good understanding of how they work, you have another data point which you can weigh against community, internal development feedback, and what you're seeing in the industry. Like all of those things inform the decisions you make. They do not predestine it.
Hans, you talked about finding the right places to respond, which can be hard. Like it can be hard to find the balance between, someone loud in our community says there's this issue, we want to obviously address it, but do we want to start a precedent of this loud person has complained and we have jumped and fixed it? Sometimes we can find ourselves in a difficult position of choosing to act based on that or not. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to be as as a game, we tend to be pretty engaged in a lot of the community channels with our players. Our Reddit, for example, we're very engaged in, and we try and be pretty transparent, in terms of responding actively. If we have players that are speaking up about issues that they're having, things of that sort, like we won't only be transparent about the things we are going to do, we'll also be very transparent about the things we aren't going to do. And it's one of the things that the more we've leaned into that, the actual better engagement we've had with the community. It doesn't mean that there aren't people that are engaging in those communities that continue to be very vocal or very outspoken, and that's fine. But the vast majority, as long as we are having that really transparent conversation, and not just our community folks, and I want to be clear about that, having the actual game developers involved in that community and conversation loop really helps us have a level of transparency that builds trust with the vast majority of people. And then we end up building a community that has advocates for us, where it's not only us saying, hey, well, this is why we're doing this. We have people who can actually echo those messages, which helps with the people who are maybe repeatedly incredibly vocal on a single issue. That has been one of the ways that we tend to try and work with those situations. So.
Nice. And when it comes to sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, just briefly, I was just going to say, I think it's a fantastic point to make sure that you are differentiating between the vocal portion of the community and the silent portion of the community. And then on top of that, the job as a good designer would be to, when you're listening to the feedback that you're getting from the vocal community, you have to not just be taking it face value and literally saying, players will say, I want this specifically. You have to think about what is motivating them to ask for those things. And if you're hearing them ask for a lot of similar things, it's like, okay, what are the set of possible reasons that a person could be asking for these different things? Where in the game, might it be causing those things to come up? And then from there, deciding what are the potential set of solutions. So it's a little bit you need to be careful to be involved in that way. Otherwise, you can get into this sort of ruling by democracy, and maybe the player doesn't know, they feel what they want, but they might not know specifically as a game designer what the best approach for that would be in your game. So it's important to still play the designer role and not just take it face value.
For sure. And the vocal community that you mentioned, they obviously can have an impact on everyone. If you are watching your favorite streamer and he's saying, potato server, everything's broken, people get that feeling too, or we run into it a lot with cheaters. People talk about how cheating is rampant, and whether or not they're actually encountering cheaters, they still have the feeling of, I watched my favorite streamer encounter a cheater, therefore potato servers, lots of cheaters. So how have you guys found ways to deal with that through either communication or through, I don't know, actively reaching out to those people?
That's a really good one. I would say that there is no single channel for it. And the ultimate irony here is that often the people who will complain the loudest have the least interest in challenging their beliefs. Because there are lots of reasons as to why a person will want to say, I clearly lost because this person was cheating. Because there's actually a meme about this. And given the amount of multiplayer games I play, I always laugh about this, which is often, this has to be your fault. Because if it's not your fault, it's my fault. And I don't like that. I feel like that is a good way of summarizing maybe the emotion that goes into that call. It's not to say that sometimes you don't see people that are actively cheating. Absolutely, that happens. It's happened in games forever. And normally what you want to do is you want to publish the amount of people you banned from that. Be as transparent as you can be with people, especially when they report a cheater, that what they did was actioned upon. And you actually want to basically credit people out to that so that they can understand, no, there is a good feedback loop. You flagged the cheater, or you flagged really negative behavior, and we fixed that. And therefore there was, you've opened an issue, we listened to you, we closed the issue, ideally you are helping clean up the problem. On the other hand, there are significant discrepancies of just skill, which I think is another big one, where if you make a game that is hard enough, people will just assume others are cheating, not realizing that they've effectively just been skill gapped. And so I guess so largely skill gapped that it would almost be like starting off in chess and losing to a chess grandmaster. You would assume they're cheating because there's literally nothing you can, like, you don't even understand the game that they're playing, because they're playing a fundamentally different game than you. It just so happens to use the same pieces. So some of that is actually just an education. And from case where you actually have, as you mentioned before, like larger streamers who are talking about this, I think you're actually seeing more of this happen, where as games roll out, you're seeing more people reach out and actually play with the streamer or answer the streamer's questions as they're playing, like just ways to effectively arm them and educate them into the game they're getting ready to play, which I think is a big step forward, because ideally it elevates the experience for everyone involved. Though, to be fair, it's also extremely time consuming, and I totally understand it if you do not have a studio bandwidth that can actually handle that. But it is definitely worth it to put out that amount of information so that people really can understand what's happening, so that you can separate skill gap from being cheated.
Yeah, I think that helps illustrate the levels of mastery in the game as well, so that the players can really understand that those tiers do exist, like being able to actualize, oh, somebody is actually this good. But again, that's, I mean, supporting a really good creators environment is a big piece of that. One of the things on Dauntless, like we tend to work with some of the content creators. We have a Discord dedicated to them, and we work with them to get early access sometimes, so that they can see, what new content's coming down the line, and being able to be prepared for that. It does create a really a nice loop for preventing some of that, and understanding those layers of mastery for the entire player base. So if they engage with the community. So
do you guys find like it's easy to let kind of players teach other players versus having people internally doing it actively? Or
I think you obviously want it to be that players will teach other players. I mean, in many ways, this is actually one of the benefits of engaging your diehard community. I mean, I think Hans said it very well before. It's like people who kickstarted or founded your game are likely to be your biggest cheerleaders to your community and to strangers, because they not only did they get it early, but assuming you engage them the entire way through and you launch something at the end, they have wealths of knowledge to share with people. And even if they can't do the things that are extremely ultra high tier, they at least understand those things exist in the game because they've seen it before, and they understand at least in concept how you'd be able to do them reliably. So, I mean, you obviously want things to scale in that fashion. It often becomes a question around timing, because like an example which I'll use is, given the fact that we've exchanged the old days of marketing and wow, I can't even believe this, magazines and websites for influencers. And because now we're in the realm of influencers, it is a point where and sorry, I'm going to take a step back because I want to make sure I explain the motivations before I articulate my point more. An influencer effectively, they create entertainment as part of their content. That is what they are trying to do. So to the previous points around cheaters or skill gaps or such, not, there's no benefit for an influencer to say they were just skill gapped by a person. Like, that doesn't help. That doesn't help their brand. It doesn't help them at all. And I would go so far as say it's actually just straight up better for them to just make entertaining content. And sometimes it's entertaining to watch a person be mad at someone on screen, because we've all been there. We've all played a game before where we've died sad and alone and been angry. So it's a little bit cathartic to see someone else do that. However, that's not the first blush you want anyone to have with your game. So the more you have to actually focus on looping in larger scale streamers, you want to make sure that is not their experience. So that's why it's a mixture of the two. Like, in most cases, you want to rely on your community to do things, but depending on the scale of the person, you really want to make sure that at least you put your best effort in making sure that their first experience made sense, even if in fact they lost.
You guys are all working on free-to-play games, yes?
Yes.
yes.
Yeah. So in those cases, do you think like it's more important at the moment you launch, since you could have like a really wide audience and you need to hopefully like retain them quickly? How important do you think like tutorials and stuff like that are to onboard people?
Interesting. I think I may expose myself as the hater in this group. I actually feel that tutorials are generally useless. And I say that not because of the fact that I don't think they're important. I think that some percentage of your players will actually play them. I think the majority of your players are not going to play them. The majority of your players are going to jump in your game believing they know how to play it already. And if they get smashed, they might come back and try to play the tutorial just to see if there's something they missed. But for the most part, people are in and off to the races. And it's actually one of the things that I feel happens a lot when it comes to retention funnels, where often one of the resident themes I've heard through the industry has been that if your retention funnel is bad, it must be your onboarding. And I actually think that I have my own opinion here, which is, and again, it's not corroborated by any facts that I managed to find. I actually don't think that's actually your problem. If your game isn't retaining, I don't think it's people not learning the mechanics. It's people not being motivated to learn the mechanics, or people not finding the actual overall game very interesting, or both. And I think that radical ownership will help you solve that problem. I don't think teaching people how to play your game is that determinant of their behavior. I feel like most gamers who typically jump into almost every new game, they've played more games than any of us have as development, just because literally we typically work enough hours that we cannot play the games we used to play before we started working in development. So their ability to parse a new game is actually pretty high. And I would even go so far as to say that their attention span is inherently pretty low because they're playing all these other games. So in many ways, I'm not as sold on onboarding as the big problem that I feel like it often is. I think UI and UX is actually a very big problem that I think people don't talk about enough, because I think that there is a verticality of how you arrange your game in terms of using symbols that make sense to people, planning for people who might be colorblind for certain things, placing your buttons far enough apart with each other. And obviously, as Michael was mentioning before, like going to different platforms and recognizing all the ways in those platforms navigate their UI and how your game plays well with those. Like, I think all of that is not onboarding. I think all of that is UI UX. And I think that is possibly the most important thing you can do, given the fact that games as a media are based off interaction. And if it's not clear how you interact with your game, then I don't know what I'm doing in front of it. But like, I don't think it's onboarding as much personally, but I'm prepared to be very wrong. I want to be very clear. Just throwing it out there.
Someone tell him he's wrong.
Oh no, I fully agree. I hate tutorials.
No.
We actually didn't have any tutorial at all in the game until this year. And the one that we built was extremely light still. And we're still thinking through how to do it. I guess the approach we took, which I don't know if it's the right one or not, but I think it's maybe like, importance of UI. Can people learn it on their own? They will at the very beginning learn it from other community members, as we've been talking about. So that's great. Our approach to figuring out how to do some type of light tutorial and onboarding is to just like watch streamers play or watch other people play for their first time and see where they're getting tripped up. Try to polish those edges, and that could just be a UI thing. It could be a very simple little tip or a tutorial, but I do think it feels like if you have to go for a fully on Rails tutorial, in some ways it feels like admitting defeat on the other fronts, because like people don't have fun with those tutorials. You want them to, the most fun way, so you're not just teaching someone to play, you're also convincing them that your game is actually fun to play and worth playing. And tutorials like often ruin the fun of the game at the beginning. And so you don't really want your first 30 minutes of the game or whatever to not be fun, because you're just trying to rush through this tutorial that just isn't very fun to play before you get to the meat of the game. So I think it's nice, however you can let people just get in and explore on their own, and then try to predict the ways that they're going to get tripped up and help them through that.
Yeah, and I think there's a big difference between, engineering an entire tutorial versus following through that first time user experience and really looking at that UI UX, making sure that along the way there's always something for someone to engage in next. They always feel there's a call to action. And I think that drawing them through the features of your game or drawing them through the kinds of experiences of your game is probably a lot more successful because it points them in a direction and allows them to play and engage, versus I'm following this set of rails to learn one thing about this one type of experience and then coming back to the main flow. We do have a tutorial at the beginning of our game that flows in. It's pretty high level, like it lets them kind of engage pretty freely. But we invested a decent amount of time in it several years ago, and the amount of benefit we got from the overall focus was a lot lower than smaller, more experiment oriented fixes that we've done since then, where we've stopped, we've looked at, okay, quantitatively, this is where we're starting to see people having problems. Let's take a step back and look at, what does the UX look like here? Are there quests that draw them from this place to this place? We would expect them to be engaging in these systems now, but they don't seem to be. Is there something that we can do with, a weekly challenge or something of this sort that draws them at that right point over into this portion of the game? Giving people those nudges and the encouragement more than necessarily here's the rails that teaches you this thing has been a lot more successful for us.
Yeah, I definitely, I do want to mention, because mostly because I'm reading this book called Black Box Thinking currently, where they talk about how it's mostly around just focusing on errors and trying to learn as much as you can from them. Most games are built around the concept that you can make mistakes. Like that's actually, how it goes. Like we want you to actually feel like you have a volitional choice when you're playing. And actually I would go so far as to say that if you're a competitive game, your volitional choice is deliberately to make someone else's choices stop, because you're trying to effectively win and at their expense. So like, I think that you normally use a tutorial to explain to a person how to play. However, if you're making a competitive game, learning the controls is not the same as learning how to play. Like that's, again, it's no different than the chess analogy I made earlier. Like I understand how all the pieces on the chessboard move. That doesn't mean I'm a good chess player. And I feel like that's actually one of the big problems that comes out of most tutorials, is their goal is to try to teach you something that really you probably can figure out pretty quickly on your own with 1 or 2 matches, as opposed to actually finding a framework by which we can teach you, you need to duck for cover when this is happening. Or if you have, if you're using a wind gauntlet, you can use that to negate a fire spell that was cast at you that killed you. Like these are the types of teachable moments that I think are very important to have at least a concept of how you want to handle in your game. And this is something which I feel like UI, UX, and just general hit feedback has been trying to shoulder the burden for years, maybe even decades at this point in time. And it's like multiplayer games have become less about a narrative experience and far more about the visceral in the moment experience and an expression of skill. And I just don't think our current onboarding model supports that at all.
That's a great point.
I've been beaten in chess by a guy blindfolded who played with one hand, and no tutorial would have helped me in that moment. So we have a question in the chat, so I'm going to read it out. It's from Jason. He wants you guys to comment on what benchmarks or metrics determine moving forward from closed alpha to private beta to early access and then launch. So at what moment do you say, we're good, let's move on to the next benchmark?
All right, I'm actually typing out my thoughts here. The quick breakout I would say for this is, and I say this obviously as a producer whose entire job is to basically get people to communicate and get them to actually commit to things. You're going to need to go from department to department to figure it out. So as an example, for the engineering side, a model they might need in order to be able to say with confidence they can go from an alpha to a beta, let's just pick those as 2 arbitrary semi-launch points. They need 100,000 users over a period of time. They just need them to run through the actual service, run through the back end, make sure that they found any weird race conditions or any other problems that kind of go along those fronts. They also might want like one land rush scenario where it's just like a bunch of people trying to log in at the exact same time. And if they succeed in those 2 things, we're ready to move on. If you talk to the art team, the argument might be, we need to remove all the placeholder art in the game. Like that's actually what we want. In reality, you're probably not talking them down to that, because they're going to start with I need more time to finish everything. In which case you as a producer are going to tell them you don't have more time. In which case there'll be some conversations and haggling back and forth, maybe even some threats if you're really good friends with them. But at the end of the road, you will normally settle in something that is a much more objective point, which is removing all the placeholder art. And in some cases, that means using art for things it was not meant to be used for, but it's okay because it's done. And in some cases, it's actually just removing an asset altogether. And that will actually roll up to a certain amount of time. From the product and design side, that's going to be a much harder problem for you to answer. I think in general, it is difficult to break out a product into objective statements. In the past, I've used things as explicit as we should be averaging a 3-star qualitative review before we can get out of this. Like, that's it. In some cases, you want to say the median. Some cases, you want to say the average. Like, you can pick some type of objective metric. But I would also go so far as to say that depending on what you're working on and who you're working with, there is a reluctance to use objective metrics, because I think there's a general fear of the fact of what happens if you don't hit it. And I think in general, thus me reading Black Box Thinking, is because I'm trying to figure out a mental model to approach this problem, because it's actually kind of okay if you don't hit a metric, because that's why the metrics are supposed to be there. They're supposed to be there to help you and your team solve a problem. So you should be okay driving towards an objective criteria. And you will just have to work really, really hard with a bunch of people to do that, because every game should have its own set of objective criteria, because every game is unique.
Yeah, and I think that to your point there, I think the act of choosing them and being able to actually measure and iterate towards them is one of the things that is getting the team ready for being ready to move from stage to stage. Like, it's actualizing, like, okay, this may not be the be all end all of like what makes our game successful, but we've identified this is something that we feel is key. We figured out how to measure it, and we've decided, like, hey, this is how we can make decisions around moving this number. And I think that's one of the things that sets up that team for success in transitioning, even if they don't hit that. Like, we wanted 81% and we're only at 79%, but we moved it from 60 to 79 and we understand the levers to get there. I think that's in a lot of ways the most important aspect of that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like, I think that your team, the thing about a live process, which I think I've taken for granted, but I think it's definitely worth calling out here, is that your team is going to be working on this for a pretty long time. Assuming your product is generally successful, I mean, they may literally be working on it for over a decade. So you really do have to understand what it takes to tackle a goal and what the levers are necessary in order to actually make pursuing the goal even viable. So I feel like Hans' point is 100% correct. It's actually, you need your team to start executing towards these criteria just so they can understand and get used to it, because there's just going to be more criteria in the future. Like, either it's going to be an ongoing update of just adding more content and more consumables or whatever for people to purchase in a store. It could also be, I'm adding a whole other feature that is meant to open up the game in a certain way that completely changes our audience and completely changes our audience makeup. But either one of those things requires you to be able to execute towards a standard, and you need to be able to understand that that standard is going to change every single time you do it. It's actually much closer to the Saturday Night Live problem of every Sunday they start with nothing, and every Saturday everything shows up, and that's it. Like, it doesn't matter how good what you did last week was, because Sunday you're back to zero again. And that's kind of the process, and that's not how people are used to working. So the sooner you can kind of roll that into your workflow, the more likely people are going to find a way to get used to it.
Yeah, I found it's a lot of what are the minimum set of things, and when you're forced to go down to the minimum set of things that you need in order to launch it, it really forces you to prioritize on those things. And then the secondary challenge I've found when you're doing live service and continuously updating and having all these launches is when you're doing that every week, constantly refining it down to the minimum set of things for the next update, then also keeping track of, okay, what are the big features that can't be done within like 4 to 6 weeks, and so would be continuously bumped down the road, and how do you manage building those at the same time as the other items and carving out time for them. And I don't really know like the perfect answer for how to do that, but one way we've handled it as a small team is sort of like, okay, don't lose track of like sitting down and doing the long-term thinking every once in a while, coming up with the really big features that you're going to start working on. And then for those, sometimes we don't even set a timeline for them. It's like, okay, we just need time like with all this other stuff, it's very schedule oriented. We know we need to have it in like this time or we can't release the update. With those other things, it's like, okay, they're going to need some design time, some brainstorming time, some testing time. Just start working on them in the background and playing around with them, and don't rush them, and then release them. You'll get a sense as you're getting closer if they're ready to release or not. And you kind of have to constantly juggle those two things with live service, because if you're missing either side of that, you fall apart, and it's very hard to do the two at once.
That has definitely been the case for us. We focused. It was very easy for us to stay very focused in that 3 to 6 month time frame at absolute maximum horizon for a long time, and we've been putting a lot of effort in the last 6 to 9 months to really extend that out. We understand that our 18-month view right now, the fidelity is quite low at the outside of that, but still giving the team the idea of what is that larger arc and what are the outcomes we're wanting to give players over time, and acknowledging that those are going to change. Like, they may look completely different when we actually hit 18 months, but like giving the team the ability to not only be thinking about like, hey, what do I need to deliver in the next 2 weeks, but the next major milestone wants to focus on this aspect of cooperative play, or, making sure that as they're in there working on things, they have that moment for like colliding the short term, I'm working on this feature, this bug, and the long term, this is what we're trying to give players in the next step. And suddenly you start to see things click together. The longer we've been able to give that visibility to the team, the more engaged they've been, versus like, I just need to deliver. Because you do, you need to deliver. But, always picking your head up at that 2 weeks and not knowing what's coming next, I think can build some anxiety and build some tedium, where having those longer threads to give you that, like, we're working on this bigger thing, can be something that really bolsters the team. And I think using the milestones, the alpha, beta, live milestones, and then for us, we do kind of half yearly milestones for anchoring that thought. It's a good way for us to kind of, have that varying fidelity. So,
yeah, I mean, one of the things that I used to think was true about production before I became a producer was that there was a point where at the beginning of a project, it's all chaos, and at the end, it's all order. And the answer to that is that's totally not right. Like, actually, the way it typically works is you normally shift from 80 to 20, and that's it. So it's like, it may be 80% mostly chaos, but there's 20% of just knowing, okay, I know what genre of game I'm making, or I know what art style of thing I'm making. Like, there's a point where you have fewer knowns at the beginning than you have at the end of the process, but there is always some degree of unknown, and the live process foundationally has to be able to accommodate that. Because if you can't completely incubate that unknown, then it becomes impossible to figure out what bigger or more ambitious swings you can take. And I also think in general, it's just healthy for the team. Like, they need to have some ability to be able to have room to think about something in an idle sense, or to make a mistake, or to try a prototype and have that work out really well or not. Like, if you don't have that time kind of baked in, you just can't really, I feel like you're going to be challenged to maintain your team health.
Yeah, and I mean, you guys talked about it a couple times about like longer post-launch support. So like shifting from the launch itself and moving a bit to long-term post-launch. Like, we plan a lot about retaining our players, since it's important and it's part of live operations. But do you guys have any tips or thoughts about retaining talent? Like, lots of people in the industry are used to working on a game and moving on to another game, and it can happen in live environments that people are like, you know what, I've done this, I would like to do something else now. Do you guys have like any ways on your teams that you balance that? Is it something that like you encourage, or that you give opportunities to people to move around, or how do you deal with it in your respective companies?
Yeah, I mean, for Phoenix, we definitely have other projects that are in incubation, incubation, pre-production, or production right now. And we do have active conversations with folks on the team about, what are their long-term goals? How do those line up? Are there ways that we can have collaboration, occur across teams? We also do, you can think of them as away missions, where people will jump out for a period of time and go help somebody else on another team. We just had somebody come over and join us for 4 sprints, actually. So, they came through, almost 2 full months from another project back into our project to help us out. And it's a nice way to sort of share some of the skills and experience, but it's also a nice way for somebody to sort of like get some new perspective, take a break, things of that sort. So we're hoping as we see our portfolio continue to grow, we have more opportunities for that. But it is a challenge. So a big piece of that is really trying to talk with people about succession planning and things of that sort, like all the way through the stack, not just, hey, you're one of these big leaders at the top of the team or something, but on the team, if you're doing work and you're like the area specialist for some aspect of the way rendering works or things of that sort, who are you pairing with? Who are you doing, who are you going through code reviews with? How are you helping them understand the kinds of things you're doing so that when there is an opportunity, there's a big opportunity for the studio, somebody who has all of this experience or have been on the team can step into that, and there's an easy transition plan for them on the team. Trying to keep live teams small is super important to us, but keeping live teams small is a challenge because the smaller you get, the more specialized somebody can become. So encouraging the top part of that T, sharing across, working on different things is an important thing, and it helps that kind of lateral movement within the company. So,
yeah. I think that in general, in terms of product fatigue, it comes in a few different guises. But I think the important part from my perspective is how burnout happens, which is typically the combination of high work expectations combined with zero control. And I think the specialization portion that you just mentioned, Hans, is 100% how that typically presents itself. Normally you can see it very easily where there's a person who literally is your quest system. And if they are sick or not there, then your quest system doesn't work anymore. And that's it. And that person may take time off, but in reality, all they're doing is migrating work they would spend in a week to now work they're spending frenziedly on a weekend. That's all that's happened. That's nightmare fuel. You don't want that. So the way we typically try to remedy that is just by a combination of just rotating people around. We want to actually make sure that there is actually a good amount of shared ownership and shared knowledge. That kind of works on 2 ways. Not only does it let you have multiple quest systems in my previous example, but it also makes sure that no one person feels as if they're trapped forever being that person, which I think is just a kind of a big portion of it. Another thing that we often will try to do, and this is something that happens a lot more with the producers as a whole, is we'll just rotate areas of influence / areas of ownership. And by that, it's coordinating the contents of a cosmetic store is foundationally different than coordinating a new game mode. And there are completely different sections of the company you're working with. There are completely different problems you now need to solve. And sometimes just having a new set of problems is actually exactly what a person wants. And that often goes a pretty good distance as well. And obviously, if you have multiple projects in the bank, then you can start peeling people over to start work on that as well. But you will normally need some hybrid of these approaches, because not everyone can go just suddenly work on the new project. And in the case of the previous aforementioned quest system, that person is stuck there forever. So you need to find a way to bridge that learning.
Yeah, you talked about burnout, and I've only ever worked in the video game industry, so I don't know how prevalent it is in other industries, but it is really prevalent in our industry. And
Yes.
do you guys think that like the sense of urgency of live games, or I don't know, the feeling of we have to address this now, or the community is loud, do you think that's something that increases it, or do you think it has any kind of impact at all?
I think there's a lot here. And by that, I mean because I guess I was fortunate in the sense that I did not, I worked in biotech before I worked in games. And that has led to certain weirdness of just how I look at games as well, because I think that your first job always influences how you approach games. And if your first job was games, then you are in a very interesting position, in my opinion, because when your passion becomes your job, that sets you up for all sorts of problems that I don't think that you're aware of until they start to go wrong. And I think the easiest way of kind of putting it out there is, if you really, really enjoy if you really enjoyed games your entire life, and you've known you always want to work in games, and now you were fortunate enough to finally work at your dream company on your dream job, there is almost always going to be a period of learning where it's probably the closest you can get to the ideal honeymoon phase of a job, where everyone around you is great, they're helpful. And again, I'm using this as the best case scenario. Obviously, there are many horror stories where it's been the exact opposite for people, and I don't want to diminish their experience. But like, let's just assume everything's great, everyone's helpful, you're doing all this work, and you're learning all sorts of new stuff, and that's all good for like maybe the first 1 to 3 years. But eventually, you get to the point where you start to see similar problems happen, and it's just more of like, working in games is very difficult. It's a very complex industry. Like, you have all the complexity that goes with technical excellence, as well as all the arbitrariness that comes with creative shot calling. It is very, very easy to be lost in the complexity. And by that, I mean, you eventually get to the point where you are now working on something that either you poured your heart and soul into that is cut at the end because of reasons you don't fully understand, or vice versa, where you now are working a ton on something you actually don't think solves the problem that is so obvious to you that you can't get other people to understand. And I think that both of those situations happen pretty much on a monthly, if not yearly basis in the games, in the act of game development. And this is, I'm going to pull this back to the live team example, because this is yet another problem you have to deal with when it comes to actually running a team. And the good news is that running a live team makes it a little bit more obvious when it's happening, because just by virtue of working on something for 2 weeks or 3 months from now, it should be pretty easy to explain to a person why something's important. That becomes much harder to do if a person's working on something that's like a 4-year project, because in many cases, like, the thing they're working on, I hate to say it, probably isn't that important, because if you're going to have 4 years to build it, I almost guarantee whatever this person's working on in year 1 is going to get rebuilt maybe 3 times before it actually ships. And I know that, and if they're experienced, they know that, and maybe there's a wink and a nudge and you move on. But I think that learning and that mentorship and that level, that feedback loop, is a painful one internal to the industry. And if you're fortunate, you get a good mentor, you get a good manager, you have a whole web of people you can kind of talk with that can keep you somewhat centered. But I actually think that game development tends to be actually a pretty isolated thing. And it's even more so now in COVID land, where we're all remote. Like, most people are working and just trying to solve the problems that they have in front of them and do the best they can for their team without causing too much of a problem. And that road will lead you to burnout just as often, if not more often, than perhaps being more outspoken about problems and trying to find actual solutions. So that was a very long answer. I apologize.
No, it's good. Thanks. So Hans, you mentioned like keeping teams small. Oh, by the way, my first job was actually McDonald's. This is just my first like career. But I also dabbled in cake decorating and some other random stuff. But officially, video games is like the career industry. Anyways, yes. So Hans, you mentioned keeping live teams small, and like one phenomenon I see on my team, we're a really large team. We do have like a team that really focuses on live and operations, and what I see is like a kind of big portion of the team who like really praises the experience of working on a live game, that like they don't live that crunch, they don't do overtime. Like, if a rare case occurs that they do overtime, like their manager is on it, like they're having a day off next week. This is absolutely unacceptable. And then you have kind of the operation team who lives in like a world of perpetual crunch and doesn't have the same experience. And yeah, you mentioned keeping the team small, and Cardell, you mentioned like rotating and stuff. Like, for Hans, for keeping the team small, have you like noticed that, I don't know, it can have an impact when it's like less people managing it versus other people like in relaxation land?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think if you're attempting to keep the overall team small, like you run a much larger risk of having, those 1, 2, 3, 4 people that are at the focal point, kind of, going back to the conversation earlier, where they can become the linchpins. And I definitely think that that's, something that you, from a management perspective, need to keep a really close eye on. Ensure that you're trying to support them, have really active conversations, make sure when they take time off, they can take time off. But like for us, one of the things that we try and do is we try and have all of the teams, the feature teams, as well as what we refer to as the efficient delivery team, involved in the entire cycle from, feature inception all the way through release. So, yes, admittedly, the team that handles that release is right there at the end, and the service engineers happen to be on that team that are going to be on call and things of that sort. But trying to make sure that those teams are working very closely together, and we try and push as much of the responsibility for those things, up into those development teams, so that there's a high level of accountability all the way through the release pipeline. When there is an issue, it's not on that team themselves to go in and dive in and fix that feature or things of that sort. Those teams have to come together, work cross team, get those things done. Where we start to run into a lot of challenges, though, is like as we start to think about, the 24/7 on-call rotations and things of that sort, where trying to find people with the right context to be able to support the actual response and get coverage so that people actually have good chunks of time off in between them is always a challenge. Like right now, our on-call rotation spans across multiple teams inside the company. So some people who respond may not have as much context as the folks directly on Dauntless, but it is a way that we've been sharing some of that load. We are actually working on some new conversations now about like, hey, how do we bring that into the team itself and share that load across also the production staff, as well as engineers that may not be service engineers, but starting to build again that cross training where people can take that first round to share some of that load, so that people aren't like, hey, we have two people and they're 1 week on, 1 week off, 1 week on, 1 week off, which, you can do for a while, but you can't do for 2 years, 3 years. That's the guaranteed path to burnout. So.
Yep. Yeah, I firmly agree with that one. I don't even really have much to add to that, besides for like, it only gets worse the more platforms you add. So, so keep that in mind as it goes through. Like, eventually, you need to start trying to prioritize what is healthy for your team, and not just what increases your velocity. And that's always a weird conversation, because I would argue that most developers I've worked with rarely actually tell you what's healthy for them. They will almost always tell you what should happen, and even if what should happen is actually a horrible thing that will put their personal life under massive amounts of stress and might not even solve the problem, they won't balk from suggesting it. And I think that the way this kind of is the framework that I was talking before about the framework of decisions. Like you really do need to sit down and figure out, well, what's really important for you and what's really important for you to be able to say about your team. And then in some cases, protect them from themselves, because the operations group will always burn hot. My belief is that if you ever want to know how a company actually works, talk to their QA and operations teams. Like that will tell you actually what's happening. And there is no break for that, because typically that's where you pay for the cost of any mistakes you made earlier. And it's great. And I'm happy to hear that other people have adopted the model of making sure that the other teams come in to fix problems that the release or operations tends to find. But even then, when that happens, people then need to understand that because this happened, we're not adding more time to the release window. Not because we couldn't crunch and make it, but because we don't want to crunch every time because someone made a mistake, which they then fix in an hour, but ultimately reset all of our exit tests and put us right back to square one and pretend that work was free, because it's not.
100%. Particularly when you start talking about multiple platforms too, because then you have all of these first-party windows you need to line up and so on and so forth, like getting waivers signed to ensure you can release across all the platforms at the right time. And then if you add crossplay, like there's you need to keep all of your platforms, equivalent. So you can't be like, oh, we're just going to release this fix on PlayStation and let that ride for a little while. And Nintendo would not be really pleased, if you go down that path. So, the complexity multiplies very quickly.
Yeah, you really haven't lived, and so you've had the conversation with people where it's like kind of deadpan. Where sure, we can do this right now, but who's going to tell the Sony players that they can't play our game until 2 weeks from now? Because it's not going to be me. I'm not going to be the person who's saying that. I want someone else to say that to them. And normally that is a forcing of perspective where people are like, well, maybe this isn't that big of a deal. It's like, you think.
Not telling them is the answer.
Exactly. Oh, we're just not going to tell them. They'll find out on their own.
Cool. So some of the other panels have covered the topic, and god dang it if we're not going to cover it, but working from home. So you guys have 3 really different experiences, and like regardless of your preference, I'd love to hear your perspective on like how you think it's going to affect the industry as a whole for live games in particular. Like there's less kind of room to move milestones. Like if you have a planned ship date or if you're already shipped, you have to kind of keep trucking. The train doesn't stop. So yeah, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. Michael, I'm going to start with you since you were remote even before the pandemic. So you probably have the most experience with how it works, and maybe some other people have experience with how it doesn't.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Matt Mullenweg's writing on remote work, the multiple levels of remote, and we were fortunate enough to, since we've been doing remote for so long. My co-founder and I have known each other since we were 3, and when we started working on the game together, just the 2 of us, he was in Vancouver and I was in San Francisco. So we started remote, and then as we hired, everyone was in different places. So it was a big benefit to start that way. And I can imagine when you have an office at the beginning, because my previous job was in an office before this. It's hard when you have groups that in an office you can talk across the table or talk across your desk. And then the online group is talking all in Discord or Slack or something, and then have 2 separate conversations where everyone's not hearing everything. I think one of the biggest benefits of being fully remote, or enforcing it if you have a mixed environment, is making sure that all of the communication happens in a place where it's accessible to everyone who needs to hear it. So from the beginning, all our chat is always in Discord. We, as much as possible, try to make all of the channels like fully open to anyone, so anyone can potentially see whatever they need to see. Eventually that becomes a bit too much, because obviously if people are working in their own domains, even if they have access to those other channels, they aren't necessarily always going to read it, but it's convenient if you can link to it. So yeah, I don't know I don't know where to go next with that, but yeah, maybe pass it off to someone else.
I'll jump on this one next, I suppose. So I actually think remote foundationally changes a lot that I only think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg on. So I feel like having more and more people be remote, especially for live service games, increases your chance of having a team that is actually capable of doing more global coverage. Look, when you consider the fact that we were just talking about operations and how having a person on call every day is miserable. Well, imagine a world where you had people kind of just happen to be around the world, where their workday happens to be able to cover for each other. Like that is actually far more reasonable in a fully remote world than it ever would have been outside of one. And that might actually just be a better way of running a team, like just straight up, just like without any equivocation. And now the door is open. I think that remote inherently is going to make indie development more challenging. And I say that because of the fact that I think that in the past, large companies were geo-locked, in the sense that if you wanted to work at Blizzard Activision, you need to live in one of these 2 or 3 places. If you wanted to work in Ubisoft, you had to work in one of these 3 places. In a world, exactly. Now that's no longer the case. Like potentially you could work for them anywhere. And this is one of those situations where if you have people whom were they were themselves softly geographically locked, they have way more options of employment. And that means that inherently independent developers need to figure out what is the value proposition they have for developers at this stage. Whereas before, you kind of got that for free. Now you have to just consider it. And in some cases, like freedom and autonomy and the ability to pursue these other things and way more control, like all those things are all still there. I'm not trying to diminish them. I'm really saying it's one other piece that has now been taken away in the larger puzzle of what it is to make games and games in the space. I think that you're going to see effective influencer culture will infiltrate game development. And by that I mean you're going to see more people cutting videos where they talk to each other. You're going to see more people trying to find a way to actually use shorthand to communicate relatively complex ideas, because the more remote you are, the less of a guarantee you even share office hours. So there's a world where, legitimately speaking, the majority of your conversations with a person might almost be via video email, where you're explaining a larger problem or process to them and what your thoughts are. They in turn digest that, maybe send you a mail back. But that level of paper trail doesn't really ever exist. It never really existed for us in the past. And I actually think that's kind of good, because it kind of forces more objective analysis. Whereas in the past, that was just abstracted away between the magic that happened in a meeting room, where someone might have taken shoddy notes, but they probably didn't. And then I guess the last thing, which I think is maybe a bit of a theme here, is game development can be a kind of a very, very internal, like somewhat lonely experience. I think that being remote is going to push that more to the front for folks, which means there's going to be more of an attempt to try to find a way to bridge those gaps. And I think we are already doing it internally, of just trying to set up more and more activities that reward kind of reaching out to other folks and meeting people you normally wouldn't interact with. Because now, like, it's not like it was when you shared an office where you happen to just walk by and see a new person, or hear a bunch of people talking about something that you too like and enjoy. Like, that doesn't happen anymore. And therefore you need to find other ways to kind of bridge that gap. And I don't know, I think that all of those things are going to kind of foundationally change how teams work in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure. Changing times, but we're all adapting. Cool. So another thing I wanted to ask you guys, obviously there's a lot of milestones, like you've all mentioned, like your cadences and, finding the right pattern, like up 1 week is too much, try 2 weeks, try a month, whatever. And I mean, often you hit a lot of milestones, but since you're kind of always preparing to ship, you're always closing something, you're always like chasing after something that you need to address after going live. So like, for you guys, how have you like found time with your teams to kind of make sure that you're really like stopping and actually celebrating those milestones?
I will say right up front, I am horrible at that. Straight up. It's actually the point where the production team and the QA team makes fun of me, because they're just like, you never really stop. And it's like, it's not that I don't stop. It's that I just always have something else to do. I think that it's super important for everyone to be better than me, and I try to push on the team to do that. Thankfully, a lot of the other team is way better than me about this. Like, we will often try to do miniature celebrations whenever we achieve one of our objectives, whatever that objective might be. I try to specifically broadcast anytime a person does something specifically challenging that they were actually working on for a good chunk of time. No matter how small it is, I think it's important for people to understand like the little victories that kind of bring you to the big one. But I know that this is something that I've talked about even with the rest of our executive team. Like, we are really bad at celebrating our victories, which is not a good personality trait. So,
yeah, particularly since COVID, this has become even more challenging. Not having that presence. Dallas itself is pretty lucky. We're actually predominantly back in the office at this point together. The rest of Phoenix Labs is still very, very remote because of COVID. But on our team, we try and do two things. Like, to the earlier point, we do, when we have larger milestones, we hit larger releases, we hit things of that sort. We always ensure that we're trying to tie in, like, what's a group lunch? How do we get group playtime? How do we put those things together? Maybe we'll do some kind of a swag or celebration that comes on, like, but something that forces us to come together and like stop for a moment and have that time to engage with the game or engage with the community, and do that in a celebratory way. But we also, on a regular cadence to try and foster this, is we do a mid-sprint check-in with the whole team. So each of the individual feature teams themselves, we take an hour on the Friday of the middle of the sprint, and the teams themselves get to like, what's the coolest thing we're working on right now? Or what's the thing that just bit us? And like, we have a really informal chat kind of like this, where everybody gets together, and we hop on Zoom for people who are still remote. And just get that moment to like talk through like that cool thing or that next challenge, and encourage the social interaction versus and we did 15 points in this, like, try and avoid that aspect, and more definitely the like, oh my God, here's a tone video we worked on to try and like see what this next behemoth is going to look like. That is so funny. Like, and everybody gets on it and gives feedback. It helps kind of give the slump, what can be the slump in the middle of the sprint, something really exciting to work towards. So
we used to have cookies, cookies at one of our like season kickoffs, and like I swear to God, to this day, those cookies are still like the greatest celebration anyone had. We'd try to do like big parties and stuff, but like, nope, it was the season kickoff cookies that people miss the most. Well, so we have like 15 minutes left. So I'm going to come with more interesting questions. So what I want to ask you guys is, like, obviously we want our games to live forever. Sometimes they don't. So when you guys are making a game, launching a game, do you already like consider the plan of like eventually sunlighting your game, or is it something that you face like when you get to it, like a slow march to death, or something that you go in with of like, okay, once we reach this point, we need to, change our strategy?
I would say my approach to this has changed over time. I think when I first started off, it was you go as hard as you can for as long as you can and fight the entire way through. I now have shifted, partially because of the fact of, first off, that's exhausting. It's very, very fatiguing to be that way all the time. And second off, it also directly fights against one of the things we talked about earlier about the concept of having objective goals and the ability to actually clearly take in all the information you get with low to no ulterior motive. I think that in general, my approach now is every game you work on it's not only not alive, it needs to prove to you it's not dead. And I think that to me is a bit of a humbling realization to make, like more in the middle of my career, because the fact that like it requires you to assume that all of your ideas aren't great. And I think that that's one of those things that by saying it's like, oh, like obviously everyone thinks that, like everyone should realize their ideas aren't all great, but you'd be surprised how many people think their ideas are great, especially by that time they're willing to talk to you about them. And like, you need to not let that infect a critical assessment of what you've worked on. Like, we are professionals first and foremost. Like we are not, this is not a hobby. Like, we are trying our best to build something that we think has the maximum legs we can possibly give it. And part of doing that is to look at something very critically. So I would say that now I'm much more at the point of trying to be very, very, very dogmatic around, does this make sense? Does this not? If we're putting more work in, what are we trying to solve? And what does its success look like? And if you adopt that philosophy early, you can keep it forever. I mean, even your game lasts forever. Like, there's no reason to stop approaching it that way. However, if you don't adopt that philosophy early, you will struggle to fix problems. Because you might try to patch holes with passion as opposed to work. And I can assure you that they are not fungible.
Yeah, we only have the one game, so we haven't, and we're not working on a next project. So I guess in that way, it's not, we haven't had to go through this yet, but we do take that same approach with every feature and new mode and different thing that we build in the game, trying not to be too precious about any aspect of the game. Anything that's been just released, let the feedback roll in, try to be as critical about it as we can ourselves, find anything wrong with it, not be afraid to any new big thing that we're building, decide, oh, hey, that actually didn't work as well as we thought it did. Maybe we should scrap that, or we should build it differently this way, or and then just keep doing that over time, even within the same game. Definitely a very important thing to do. Not to be too precious. Not to try to be self-critical.
I remember at some point we had like a decree that we couldn't name things anymore, like new tools or processes. Like, they had to have really generic like names, because people would name them and like really become so attached that when that process or tool didn't work out and it was like, you know what, this isn't helping anyone, let's just can it. They were so attached to it because, they gave it a name. And at some point we had to just stop doing that, because like, this is a tool, it's meant to serve everyone. It's not, your baby, it's everyone's thing. So I guess it's similar with everything.
Yeah, there's actually a related point is the things that you're releasing and how the community gets attached to them. So we've had to be very careful with that. Like I feel like the community would be more likely to get even more attached to something than we necessarily would. We could look at it and go, okay, actually we could scrap this, or we could fix it, or we could make it better. But once people have things, like they don't like to lose them later, right? Once they're out. So we're constantly thinking about that now. Whenever we're building anything, like we're building multiple different modes, and we've intentionally made them. We're releasing them all as limited time modes. It's like, okay, down the road, maybe one of these could become permanent. Maybe we could feel that it was good enough to keep it around, but we're releasing everything with the intent of these are all limited time modes, because that gives us the ability to take it away again because it's communicated up front, go back, fix it. Maybe we can re-release it, but try to avoid that scenario of like, okay, once you have it, you can never remove it again.
Yeah, that to that kind of sort of seasonal content, that's been something that has actually kind of been a challenge for us, kind of going back to the conversation earlier about community versus audience, where when we had seasonal modes, you know, it was very easy for us to communicate that to our community and have them be aware of all of these things. But we started to see negative responses from the actual audience as we started taking features away from the seasonal cadence, because they were having a hard time, like, understanding, like, well, why can't I go for this thing that I was trying to go for just the other day? And finding better ways for us to drive in-game communication and things of that sort around those things, so that the audience as a whole, not necessarily just our communities, were there. That was a big challenge for us. So, and we're still working on that. So.
Yeah, there's an interesting second side to it too, where if you're constantly doing just like limited time modes, that you would think of them when you were building them as limited time and maybe not put as much time or thought into them, and like that's also not very sustainable, especially as an indie. So when we're thinking about these modes, we're simultaneously talking about them as limited time modes, so it's okay to take them away, and if one's not working, don't bring it back or rework it a lot. But at the same time, not be just thinking about it as, okay, we're going to put all this work in to build this thing and it's just going to be gone a couple weeks later, so don't spend too much time on it. The best case scenario is if we could eventually keep one of those modes long term, so that you have like, okay, now we have two modes that are almost as good as each other, that are that the players can enjoy long term.
I'm just laughing because I keep thinking of like all of the content that has just vanished into the ether over the years. I mean, just consider like all the event-driven content. Even actually, the most recent juggernaut of this is Fortnite itself. Like each of their seasons happens and then goes away, and like, you're talking potentially thousands of developers are working on this, and they put their effort into it. You get one ridiculously extravagant music video, and that content just gets deleted. It exists in YouTube and exists in YouTube only. And like everything we do is so. All multiplayer online games are so disposable. It's actually alarming. Like when you really consider what's happening. But like as a developer, nothing you build is disposable until you stop working on it. Right. So like all the limited time modes you talked about before are great examples of this, because it's so tempting to cut corners or do things that you are kind of arguably degenerate mechanics because it's okay because it's a novelty mode. But the reality is it still takes time. You have to build it in such a way that it's actually fault tolerant. And on top of all of that, there's an opportunity cost of you building it as opposed to building something that might be permanent. And like, these are all things you kind of have to weigh when you come into building anything, which is why I think it's so important to really have a very clear understanding of exactly what your goal is in order to figure out the appropriate tool to use. Yeah, I think it's a dangerous mindset to be in too, to be building stuff where in advance you think it's going to be disposable, because you won't be building your best. You won't be doing your best work if you think it's going to be disposable. So I think it's very interesting. We're working within this live service thing, trying to still build things that last and that you can keep them around. It's one of the reasons too that we decided, rather than building multiple different maps, to continuously evolve the one map and just be iterating on it and improving it, so that it doesn't
go away, and hopefully the areas that we remove, we're not just removing them for novelty, we're just trying to continuously improve the map over time. And so we've kind of strategically left areas where there's like a lot of forest or something, and it's like future development goes there, right? Like we've got more land area.
Yeah, we've also landed into investing in a lot of our seasonal content that way too, where it's like we do bring that seasonal content back, where we have, it's sort of a temporary mode, but it gives us the opportunity every year to come back, revisit, add a little bit more, make it a little more robust, bring it back for players. And going back to the launch cookies sort of enjoyment of it, players can come back and like re-experience what the previous Frostfall event was going to be like, but it's something a little bit new. It's got a new way of looking at it, but the core tech is something that we brought from that previous work forward into that next year.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any experiences in your games where like, you have someone who wants to try something crazy, like something that maybe the community has wanted and it's totally wild and out of the box, and like at what point do you say like, no, we are this kind of game, we are not doing this, or like maybe let's filter it somewhere else? Do you guys have any experiences with that?
Yeah, much more so on the licensed project I've worked on. Like, so for making Lord of the Rings Online is a great example of this. Like, a lot of that game was built looping in Saul's Ants as an agency the entire way through, and we wanted to make sure we were extremely respectful about their intellectual property and what was okay to do versus what was not. And there is a pretty significant discrepancy between what a hardcore engaged MMO audience wants compared to what Tolkien's estate wants. Like, I can assure you, there's a Venn diagram, and it's a very, very slim overlap. And maybe the only overlap there is a game. Like, other than that, like what you do in the game, probably some debates and differences there. So in many cases, like I believe actually it was Michael who said this earlier, but I could be wrong about the whole. It's about a lot about active listening and trying to basically adjust the spirit of the feedback that the community is giving you while not doing it via the letter. Because I think it's very important for any live service to truly recognize the fact that if you've been around for more than a few years, there is a vibrant community of people who've gone through actual life changes while playing your game. Like, they have anchored themselves to the game in a way that it's almost become part of their personality. And because of that fact, you can't really just be one execution of a game, is maybe the best way of putting it. Like, there needs to be multiple facets of what you do. There should be some humor, there should be some action, there should be some adventure. Like, you want all of it within that experience, because the game has grown to such an extent that you should be able to find moments of humor in it, in addition to, moments of strife or moments of frustration. Like, the relationship is just that much more complex, and therefore can sustain that much more. So I do think in general, when the audience is claiming that they want something, even if that something doesn't fit with your preconception of what your game is, you really do have to actively scrutinize it and ask yourself, can I fit something in here that would satisfy this need? In most cases, the answer is probably yes. You just need to be creative about how you're going to do it.
Yeah, fully agree.
Well, we're getting to the end of our time, so I'm going to pass it to you guys to say a quick last remark if you want to. So Hans, take it away.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody on the panel. This has been a really fun conversation, and everybody who tuned in. One of the things for me, like I much like this conversation, the idea of working on a live game really kind of has this level of like energy, this level of commitment, and bringing the team together to really iterate towards those rapid moments of delivering content to players. It's one of the things that absolutely has made working in the games industry continue to be more and more exciting as my career has moved on, versus kind of getting old and stodgy at my age about working on games. So I, encourage anybody who's looking to go down this path to, find a team that you like to work on, and really dive into the whole experience, not just I'm working on my one feature. Like, own that all the way through the stack, own it all the way to the community, and take that feedback and bring those conversations back into your team. That's really where the value comes from. So,
thanks, Hans. Michael?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We started like from the beginning when we were writing the story of the game and developing the world, just thinking through it as like, okay, we have an idea for some of the types of things we might want to build, some of the experiences we might want to create. How can we create this whole world that basically lets us play in that space and makes it like maximally possible? I guess good thing to not be working with established IP, but like create an IP that's like, okay, how do we just create an IP that doesn't limit us to whatever we come up with? Like, we'll find a way to weave it into the story. We'll find a way to do it. Like, create a place that's like fun to create, and then, like you said, expanding that to the community as well. I feel like the Discord server and everything is sort of an extension of the game, where it's like, okay, here's all the inhabitants of this world who are living there together and hanging out. Sometimes they're just chatting, not playing, but I think that is definitely the biggest thing we've learned from this like live service thing, is like it's a whole big interconnected ecosystem, extends to your team, your community, the game that you're building, just trying to build like a fun space to exist within and play within.
Thanks, Michael. Carter, you're up.
All right.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's funny. I'm gonna shift gears slightly. I mean, first off, thanks to everyone for tuning in. I think these panels are wild and really interesting. I wish there had been more of them when I started off in games. I will take this as an opportunity to mostly implore each and every person who has taken the time to actually listen in. Don't hesitate to really try to figure out what matters to you in terms of how you work and what's important to you in order to keep you energized in your work. Make sure you can articulate those things, write them out if you have to, and then over time, update them. Because what will happen as you stay in games for longer, the reason why I love games in all honesty is because every year and a half, my role has foundationally changed. Like, something always changes in games, and the ground is always shaking. So you really do need to have a clear understanding of who you are, what energizes you, and what de-energizes you. So please, if you have not done that, take the time, do it, because that will make it much easier for you to take inbound advice or reject inbound advice that is not useful for you.
Thank you. So thanks so much to the three of you guys. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you. Hans, you swapped in at the last moment. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you today. And yeah, thanks to the audience for listening. Thank you to the program committee for setting everything up. I'm sure it was insane to do this in the current circumstances, and you did an amazing job. And yeah, thanks to everyone. So I hope everyone's going to come back and enjoy the next conference today, which is a VIP session with some very talented musicians and songwriters as they explore their endeavor of composing songs about video games. So that's going to be today between 3 and 4 Montreal time. So thanks and bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.